Burma, June 1944. The jungle breathed with heat and silence, broken only by the muffled shuffle of boots in the undergrowth. A column of Japanese infantry moved like shadows beneath the dense canopy, their uniforms soaked with sweat, their rifles cradled low, trusting in the one strategy that had kept them alive for months: march at night, hide by day. For them, the darkness was more than concealment. It was doctrine survival carved into habit. Allied aircraft couldn't see through the forest at night. They believed that. Their officers believed that. Their generals believed that. The moon hung high but veiled in clouds, and the men marched with quiet confidence, unaware that this night was different, unaware that miles above them, a shape was circling, slow, wide, silent. It wasn't a bomber. It wasn't a scout plane. It was something new. Something designed not to search, but to kill. The AC-47 Spooky, a retrofitted transport plane turned airborne gunship, loitered overhead with death strapped to its sides. 320mm cannons wired into a fire control system that could unleash 1,000 rounds in seconds. Each burst drew a ring of fire into the jungle below. But these weren't blind shots. No. They were laced with phosphorus and light tracers that didn't just burn but illuminated, guided, corrected themselves mid-air. And below, the Japanese soldiers, cloaked in darkness for so long they believed it to be armor, were walking straight into the mouth of a weapon they didn't know existed. They would never hear it coming until the jungle itself erupted. What they thought was shelter had become a stage. And on this stage, in the dead of night, the rules of war had just changed. The sky was no longer blind. It was hunting. At 02:13 a.m., the jungle canopy still held its breath, unaware that the silence was about to be ruptured by something unnatural. From the forward airstrip carved into the mud outside Myitkyina, the AC-47 gunship call sign Widow 9 had lifted off just before midnight, heavy with ammunition and grim intent. The crew of 6 pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, 2 gunners, and a fire control officer had flown this route before, but never with a confirmed ground target. Tonight was different. Tonight, ground radar stations had picked up a thermal bloom moving along a ridgeline near the Thai-Burmese border, too linear, too rhythmic, too warm to be anything but infantry, human heat marching in formation. The jungle thought it was safe. It was wrong. The AC-47 was never meant to be a warplane. It had once ferried crates and cargo across oceans, but war had rewritten its purpose. Now its cargo was death. 320mm Vulcan cannons protruded from the port side, anchored to a custom fire control rig designed to spray a continuous arc of fire while the aircraft circled above its target. They called it the Dragon's Breath, a wall of glowing tracers that could incinerate an entire football field in under a minute. And tonight the Dragon would breathe fire into the jungle. At 0216, the gunship reached altitude 4,000 feet above sea level. The fire control officer leaned over his scope, confirming coordinates. Below, through the thermal scope, the enemy looked like a living serpent, winding between trees. 600 men, unaware that a weapon orbiting silently above them had already locked on. Target confirmed. Beginning run. The pilot banked left. The aircraft began its wide spiral nose, slightly up belly exposed to the earth, like a predator showing its teeth. The first burst came at 02:17:02. A line of fire erupted from the left side of the gunship, stitching a path of destruction down through the canopy. Every 5th round a tracer glowing orange, illuminating the jungle as if dawn had broken all at once. But this dawn burned. The 20mm rounds weren't just projectiles, they were statements. Each one screamed down at nearly 3,400 feet per second, tearing through leaves, wood, and flesh alike. Japanese soldiers fell where they stood, some without even knowing what hit them. There was no warning siren, no whistle of descent, only the sudden thunder and the shock wave of air splitting open. The AC-47 continued its orbit, adjusting its bank with precision born from brutal repetition. The gunners worked in a rhythm so tight it bordered on mechanical feed fire, adjust fire. Again, below chaos bloomed. Fires caught where phosphorus rounds met dry brush. Men scattered, but in the darkness of the jungle there was nowhere to go. Trees that had shielded them from aerial view now became death traps, silhouettes backlit by tracer fire. The night marching doctrine so trusted for so long was disintegrating under a hail of bullets that didn't need daylight to find their mark. By 021810, the gunship had completed its first full orbit. Over 100 enemy combatants were either dead or incapacitated, but the AC-47 didn't stop. It turned again, tracing a tighter circle, now pulling inward like a spiral staircase into the heart of the enemy. The jungle trembled. What the Japanese troops had once called the sleeping green had come alive not with wind or rain, but with rage and fire. Some soldiers fired back blindly, their Arisaka rifles cracking weakly against the roar from above. A few Type 96 machine guns lit up, spraying bullets into the darkness, hoping to strike the sky. But they were firing into memory. The gunship had already moved. Its orbit meant that no shot would ever return fire directly. It was like fighting a ghost that circled and killed without showing its face. At 0219, the second wave of fire began. This time, shorter bursts, aimed at breaking the survivors' cohesion. Communications within the Japanese unit had collapsed. Officers screamed into radios that no longer had anyone listening. The jungle, once a friend, now betrayed every movement. Each flashlight flicker, each whispered command marked a man for death. Heat sensors picked up concentrations, and the fire control officer called out new sectors. The guns responded instantly. By 0221, less than 5 minutes after the first shot, the scene below resembled a war zone from another dimension. Smoke choked the air. Bodies lay half hidden in foliage, many unrecognizable. Small fires burned, like scattered stars across the jungle floor. A few figures attempted to retreat north, crawling through mud and ash. They didn't make it far. The AC-47 had eyes on everything. Its guns didn't sweep. They hunted. The pilot's voice was calm. Fuel levels stable. Orbit sustained. "How's the heat?" "Barrels warm but clear," came the reply. The gunship could keep firing, but there was barely anything left to fire at. At 022247, the fire control officer made the call. Cease fire. Confirmed neutralization. The jungle had gone quiet again, but this was not the silence of peace. It was the vacuum left behind when everything living had either fled or fallen. The AC-47 made one final pass, a slow circle over the battlefield it had created. Below the wreckage of a full Japanese regiment lay broken, over 80% casualties estimated. Less than 9 minutes had passed. The pilot adjusted course for return. No cheers, no celebration, just the low hum of engines over a sea of smoldering green. Behind them, the jungle would recover, trees would regrow, and rain would wash the blood away. But for the men who survived, those few who crawled out and lived to speak of it, the night would never truly end. They had marched into the jungle believing the night was their shield. They left knowing it had become their grave. The jungle still smoked in the wake of the strike embers, glowing like dying stars beneath the canopy. But the real shock, the thing that would echo in the minds of every surviving soldier and in every military report for months, wasn't just the destruction. It was the method. It wasn't a bombing raid, not a strafing run, not a napalm drop. It was something else entirely. Something they had never seen before. Something the enemy didn't even have a name for yet. But the Americans called it spooky. The AC-47 gunship wasn't born a killer. It had started life as a Douglas C-47 Skytrain, the workhorse of Allied logistics, the plane that dropped paratroopers over Normandy, hauled ammo across the Himalayas, and carried wounded men out of every front line from Africa to Italy. It was never meant to circle over a battlefield and spit fire like an airborne demon. But war, as it always does, demanded reinvention. And so someone asked a question that seemed insane at first. What if we could make a cargo plane breathe fire? The result was terrifying. 3 M61 Vulcan 20mm rotary cannons, each capable of firing up to 6,000 rounds per minute, were bolted to the port side of the aircraft. Fed by massive drum magazines and stabilized by a custom-built fire control system, these weren't just guns, they were industrial shredders. When the AC-47 fired in rotation, it could deliver a storm of metal so dense, so precise, that it could trace a perfect circle of death on the ground below. Every bullet tracer, armor-piercing, high-explosive, landed within a margin of error measured in feet. This wasn't suppression fire. This was precision annihilation. Unlike the British Mosquito's 57mm Mollins gun, which fired 6-pound shells meant to penetrate steel pressure hulls and sink submarines from the sky, the AC-47 didn't care about armor. It didn't need to. It wasn't designed to hunt submarines or punch through ships. It was built for a different battlefield, a living one, chaotic shifting, hidden in trees and shadows. Where the Mosquito delivered surgical strikes, the Spooky delivered domination, total control of the terrain beneath it. A blanket of bullets so thick it drowned entire formations. And unlike most aircraft of the era, the AC-47 didn't rely on guesswork or line of sight. Mounted beneath its frame were state-of-the-art infrared sensors, rudimentary by today's standards, but revolutionary. In 1944, it could see heat, it could read motion, and most importantly, it could track targets even through the dense Southeast Asian canopy. Pair that with a computerized fire control unit that recalculated trajectory in real time, and you had a flying fortress capable of turning night into a killing ground. But what truly made the AC-47 spooky, unlike anything the Japanese had ever faced, was its firing pattern. Spiral. Not straight line, not dive and pull up. The plane flew wide, slow, methodical circles over the target zone, keeping its guns trained on a single point on the ground while orbiting around it. To a man on the jungle floor, the effect was surreal and horrifying. A ring of fire that seemed to come from nowhere, sweeping inward like a tightening noose. Each orbit brought the line of death closer, and each pass reduced the target zone further until nothing moved. No birds, no voices, no survivors. This tactic had never been used in the Pacific before. Air power here had always been about bombing runs, strafing attacks, or ground support from above and away. But this was something new. A plane that didn't just pass over but stayed, lingered, hunted. For soldiers used to ducking beneath jungle cover, the psychological effect was devastating. No trench was deep enough, no thicket thick enough. You could run, but you couldn't hide. Not from a weapon that saw heat and fired in circles. And the terror didn't end when the guns stopped. Because what Spooky left behind wasn't just bodies and debris. It left doubt, doctrine shattered, beliefs gutted. The idea that the night belonged to the Japanese, that darkness offered safety, that the jungle offered concealment, was dead. Killed not by bombs, but by bullets that glowed in the dark and curved like wrath. There were logistical marvels, too. The autoloaders borrowed engineering principles from American printing presses and food packaging systems, using centrifugal force and chain-fed belts to keep the guns supplied mid-flight, even under G-forces. The recoil management system used reinforced suspension mounts that allowed a transport aircraft to unleash hell without tearing itself apart in mid-air. Everything about the AC-47 was a fusion of industrial ingenuity and battlefield necessity. But none of that mattered to the men on the ground. They didn't see the schematics or the engineering. All they saw were the tracers, hundreds of them searing through the canopy like the jungle was being stitched shut by fire. They heard the unending growl of the Vulcan guns, a mechanical growl that swallowed all other sound. They smelled the cordite, the burning leaves, the charred flesh, and they ran when they could. Spooky didn't just kill soldiers. It killed morale. It killed hope. It forced the enemy to ask a question no army wants to face. What if we're fighting something we can't fight back against? What if we're facing not just a new weapon, but a new law of war? The AC-47 didn't bring more firepower to the battlefield. It brought presence, dominance, a sense that the sky itself had become aware, had chosen a side, and would not relent. The gunship's circle became a symbol, an omen, a silent announcement that the jungle, the night, and even the earth beneath your feet no longer answered to you. And this was only the beginning. In the jungles of Burma, in the shadows of trees older than empires, The first whispers of a new kind of warfare had begun. A warfare, not of numbers, not of tanks or bombs, but of machines that could see in the dark, strike without warning, and erase entire units in minutes. Machines, like spooky, cold, relentless, watching, waiting to circle again. What Spooky left behind wasn't just destruction, it was a void, a quiet that didn't belong in the jungle, a silence too absolute to be natural. And in that silence, something else began to grow. Not fear in the conventional sense, but something deeper, more corrosive, a kind of psychological collapse. Because the men who had survived the fire didn't walk away as soldiers. They walked away as ghosts haunted, not by what they saw, but by what they could never explain. The Japanese high command was unprepared, entirely fatally unprepared. For years, they had relied on one fundamental truth: the jungle at night belonged to them. No Western army could navigate it, let alone fly through it. Darkness was their ally, the canopy, their shield. But the AC-47 shredded that illusion, with every tracer that curved through the trees. Their first intelligence report labeled the incident as a flare-based suppression attack, a crude term that belied how little they understood. They thought they had been hit with signal flares, perhaps phosphorus bombs, something primitive meant to disorient. They didn't realize until much later that what had descended on their regiment wasn't just light, it was firepower, guided by it. And by then, the damage had already been done. Entire units refused to march at night. Not just for days, but for weeks. Field commanders abandoned night trails and rerouted convoys into daylight hours, exposing themselves to traditional bombing raids and reconnaissance patrols, just to avoid what they called the screaming night. Their tactics, once built on stealth, dissolved into a clumsy mess of exposed movements and daylight confusion. Dozens of engagements were lost, not because of Spooky's guns, but because of what it had burned into their minds, that no place was safe, not even the dark. The psychological toll carved itself into the bones of the infantry. Soldiers who had fought in Manchuria, who had survived the jungles of Guadalcanal, now broke down when the sun dipped behind the trees. The sound of a rotary engine, the faint thrum of a distant aircraft, could cause entire platoons to scatter into the underbrush, abandoning gear and orders. They called it Ghost Roar Syndrome, a name whispered between foxholes, muttered by medics scribbled in the margins of operational logs. It was real, and it was spreading. Symptoms varied. Some men stopped speaking entirely. Others compulsively scanned the sky, even in daylight. One sergeant was found digging into the base of a banyan tree with his bare hands, convinced he could tunnel away from the sky. Another, eyes wide, repeated the same phrase over and over. "It's not a plane, it's a voice. It speaks in bullets." They were not cowards. They were veterans, hardened by years of jungle warfare. But this weapon had reached into something deeper than fear. It had severed the connection between belief and reality. And once that cord was cut, there was no climbing back. The officers tried to reassert control. They barked orders, threatened courts-martial, dragged men into formations by force. But it didn't matter. The jungle had rules, and now those rules had been rewritten. One lieutenant, a survivor of the 14th Regiment, wrote in his diary 2 nights after the attack, "Darkness was once our friend. Now it breathes fire." Another, captured weeks later and interrogated by Allied forces, simply said, "We were taught to disappear into the trees." But the trees caught fire. Command tried to adapt. New directives ordered night convoys to pause every 15 minutes for listening drills. Men were trained to spot the sound signature of Spooky's engines, to fire flares as warnings, to set up anti-air positions along known routes. But none of it mattered. By the time you heard Spooky, you were already inside the circle. Rumors spread faster than fact. Stories of gunships that could see through dreams, that fired without pilots, that circled for hours like vultures. Men refused to sleep under open sky. Units buried their cooking fires under layers of mud. Discipline frayed. Communication lines broke down. One unit near the Salween River lit all their signal flares at once when a passing cargo plane flew overhead, convinced they were about to be annihilated. It was just a mail drop. But for them, paranoia had become policy. And that was the real victory. The gunship didn't need to fire another shot. It had infected the decision-making structure. Every patrol, every supply run, every inch of movement now carried the weight of possible extermination from above. The Japanese began to lose ground not from bullets, but from hesitation, from second-guessing the safety of their own doctrine, from an enemy that had turned the night once their greatest asset into a liability so lethal they feared the stars. Doctors on the ground, trained in tropical medicine and malaria protocols, began drafting new psychological reports. Some were ignored. Others were sent up the chain and buried in classified files marked urgent. One psychiatrist called it combat-induced nocturnal psychosis. Another, less technical, wrote simply, "They cannot think at night anymore." A commander in the field summarized it best in a handwritten dispatch. "We are not fighting a weapon. We are fighting a whisper, and it moves in circles." By the time Tokyo began to understand the scale of the problem, it was already metastasizing. Reinforcements arriving in the region were met not with confident orders, but with warnings. Don't sleep near the trees. Don't light fires. And for God's sake, don't look up if you hear the hum. This wasn't warfare anymore. It was psychological colonization. The battlefield hadn't just shifted. It had turned inside out. And the worst part, the Americans weren't even using it everywhere. Just a handful of AC-47 seconds deployed in limited sectors operated with surgical precision. But that didn't matter. The myth had already spread far beyond the range of their guns. Men in Burma, in Thailand, even as far as southern China, began asking the same whispered question at night. Do you hear it? Because once you heard spooky, it was already too late. They could hear it. They could feel it. But they couldn't stop it. That was the nightmare the AC-47 spooky brought with it. An invisible force circling above the treetops, unleashing hell with mathematical precision. And the worst part, the Japanese military had no way to fight back. Not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked the tools, the vision, and the integration of technology that made spooky possible. In 1944, the battlefield had begun to evolve into something far beyond conventional warfare. The Americans weren't just dropping bombs anymore. They were fusing science, engineering, and intuition into a new kind of weapon, one that operated in the blind spots of enemy doctrine, and the Japanese were blind. Their aircraft were many, agile, even formidable in daylight. The Zero was still a feared fighter. But in the blacked-out jungles of Burma, speed and maneuverability meant nothing. What mattered was the ability to see in the dark, to track movement without light, to strike a target hidden beneath leaves and fog and shadow. The Japanese didn't have that. They had no airborne radar for jungle operations, no night vision optics, no infrared detection systems, not because their scientists were inferior, but because their entire approach to warfare hadn't demanded it yet. They were still fighting the last war. America had already moved on. Spooky operated with a kind of technical awareness that simply didn't exist in the Japanese arsenal. The AC-47 wasn't fast. It wasn't armored. And yet it was invincible not through brute force, but through intelligence, through coordination, through layers of technology that when stacked together became something their enemies couldn't comprehend, let alone counter. Start with the sensors. Mounted beneath the aircraft were thermal imaging devices, calibrated to detect subtle heat variations through thick canopy. Even the faint thermal signature of a soldier's body was enough to light up the fire control system like a Christmas tree. These signals were fed into an analog computer primitive by modern standards revolutionary at the time, which translated heat maps into ballistic firing solutions. Every adjustment the gunners made was based not on guesswork, but on feedback from the jungle itself. The Japanese had nothing like this. Their pilots relied on visual acquisition flares and moonlight. They could not see what spooky saw. They could not track what spooky tracked. They couldn't even detect spooky until it was already too late. In some cases, ground troops didn't even know a gunship was overhead until the jungle erupted around them. That wasn't just a failure of equipment. It was a collapse of doctrine. They tried to adapt. Field units proposed elaborate countermeasures, heat decoys made from burning logs, reflective panels hung in trees to misdirect sensors, even complex trap zones designed to lure the gunship into flak range. But none of it worked. The decoys burned too hot or not hot enough. The reflective panels confused their own troops. The anti-aircraft guns couldn't track Spooky's orbit, much less score a hit. Every time a plan was drawn up, it failed before the ink dried. Because they weren't fighting a machine, they were fighting a system. That was what made the AC-47 so lethal. It wasn't a single breakthrough. It was a synthesis of parts. A cargo plane repurposed into a gun platform. A rotary cannon borrowed from naval design. Infrared sensors lifted from ground spotting. Teams targeting software, adapted from artillery, mathematics, and battlefield. Tactics refined from aerial photography. No one component was extraordinary, but together they created something the Japanese couldn't define, let alone counter. A war machine born from cross-disciplinary innovation. In Tokyo, military engineers pored over fragments of intelligence, downed aircraft, intercepted reports, survivor testimony. What they saw didn't make sense. A transport plane with naval cannons, night vision, spiral attack patterns calculated in real time. None of this fit into their framework. One officer reportedly said, "This weapon does not exist in our vocabulary. It is not a thing. It is an idea." They weren't wrong. The Americans had stopped building just weapons. They were now building capabilities, concepts, systems, designed not just to fire faster or fly farther, but to break assumptions. The assumption that night meant safety. The assumption that trees meant cover. The assumption that a plane had to see to kill. The AC-47 shattered every one of them. And the Japanese industrial base, overstretched, bombed, and fragmented, couldn't keep up. Even if their engineers had developed a comparable night-fighting aircraft, they lacked the radar networks to coordinate it, the computing power to guide it, the production capacity to build it in numbers. The best they could do was respond with camouflage silence and prayer. But none of those helped once Spooky found them. The irony was brutal. Japan had pioneered aerial ambush tactics at Pearl Harbor. They had redefined carrier warfare. Their torpedo bombers had terrorized the Pacific. But now, in the suffocating dark of the Burmese jungle, they were the ones being hunted from above by a slow-moving cargo plane, armed not with bombs, but with algorithms and light. There were whispers in Tokyo of building their own gunship. Engineers submitted proposals mounting Type 99 cannons on key 57 transports, wiring together rudimentary spotlight systems. But nothing made it off the drafting board. The planes couldn't handle the recoil. The flight crews weren't trained for spiraling orbits. The power supplies overheated. The project collapsed before it left the runway. Because at the core, it wasn't just about guns or planes. It was about integration. Spooky was a weapon designed by people who refused to think in categories. They didn't ask, how can we make a better bomber? They asked, what combination of unrelated tools can do something our enemies think is impossible? That kind of thinking requires more than budget and engineers. It requires a mindset, a willingness to look sideways. And the Japanese, locked in the rigidity of their doctrine, couldn't look sideways fast enough. So the AC-47 kept flying. Not because it was faster or stronger or built from better metal, but because it belonged to a war that had already moved on. A war of fusion, of data and fire, of silence and systems. A war where the jungle was no longer a hiding place, but a hunting ground. And Spooky was the predator. The enemy couldn't match it. The jungle couldn't hide from it. And now, in the weeks that followed the first deployment of the AC-47 gunship, the battlefield itself began to shift. Silently, irrevocably. The Americans didn't just win a firefight that night in June 1944. They shattered the operational rhythm of the Japanese war machine in Burma. Because once the myth of nighttime safety was destroyed, everything else collapsed in its wake. The Japanese command made a desperate decision: cancel all night marches indefinitely. What had once been a tactical pillar moving troops and supplies under cover of darkness was now a suicide sentence. The results were immediate and brutal. Reinforcement convoys that had once moved swiftly through the dense jungle under moonlight were forced to crawl during daylight hours, vulnerable to bombers, patrols, and snipers. The average resupply time increased by 60% in key sectors. What should have taken a week now took nearly 2. Ammunition ran short. Medical supplies vanished. Field units were left stranded with no way out, and the Allies knew it. Within 2 weeks of the AC-47's first confirmed kill, Allied forces launched a coordinated push into the eastern Burmese range. Jungle corridors, once fiercely defended, had been abandoned. Enemy forces fell back, not from pressure on the ground, but from what might come from the sky. Villages once used as waypoints became ghost settlements, rice fields overrun with silence. The enemy wasn't retreating from bullets. They were retreating from sound. The low hum of a circling engine, the mechanical growl of Vulcan guns spinning up. That was all it took. The Americans began referring to it in intercepted transmissions as the whisper of fire. By July, the AC-47 had become more than a weapon. It had become a message, one that said, "You are never alone, and you are never safe." Ground troops reported entire platoons fleeing at the first sign of engine noise overhead. No gunfire, no visual contact, just the faint rhythm of death echoing through the trees. In some engagements, the gunship didn't even fire. It simply orbited high above a dark halo watching. And still, enemy lines broke. The Japanese called it the Circle of Annihilation. Allied radio operators had another name for it, the fire wheel. But for those on the receiving end, it was simply terror from the sky. One soldier captured near the Salween River refused to speak for 3 days. When he finally did, his only words were, "It came from above, and it never stopped." That psychological weight outlasted any single battle. And it traveled. After the Burma campaign, the AC-47 program expanded, refined, and evolved. It was deployed again and again and again. And by the time the Vietnam War ignited 2 decades later, its silhouette had returned to the skies, this time under a new name whispered by U.S. infantry, huddled in muddy outposts, Puff the Magic Dragon. The name was deceptively whimsical. The weapon was anything but. Equipped with updated sensors, better fire control, and even more devastating cannon arrays, the AC-47 became the spiritual godfather of a new class of battlefield dominance, the gunship. Not just a platform for firepower, but a symbol of aerial presence of orbiting death. Its descendants, the AC-119 and the AC-130, would carry on its legacy with even greater destructive potential. But it was spooky that laid the foundation. Spooky that proved an old cargo plane could outthink, outsee, and outfight even the most seasoned enemy. In a classified post-campaign report filed in late 1944, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commander of Japanese forces in Southeast Asia, wrote a single chilling line. "It was not bombs or shells that broke us, it was the circle of fire that burned through both our tactics and our spirit." The admission was stark, brutal, true. And it marked something rare in war, the moment when a single weapon rewrote not just the battlefield, but the belief system that sustained an army. What the AC-47 accomplished was not measured in kill counts alone. Its greatest impact was strategic paralysis. It disrupted schedules, stalled offensives, degraded morale, and forced the enemy to adopt inefficient, self-defeating behavior. Its legacy wasn't one of mass destruction, but of doctrinal collapse. Once the enemy accepted they could no longer operate at night, they lost flexibility. Once they feared the sound of a circling engine, they lost initiative. And once they began fleeing before the first tracer was fired, they lost control of the war. This was technological dominance, not in firepower, but in timing, in placement, in emotion. And that legacy echoed forward. Modern gunships owe their existence to this convergence of old steel and new thinking. Today's AC-130. Spectre can strike with surgical precision from 1,000 feet, guiding rounds via satellite and thermal imaging. But its soul, its DNA, can be traced directly back to a rattling, low-flying, jungle-hugging C-47. with its side torn open to host 3 Vulcan cannons, and a crew crazy enough to orbit a kill zone with nothing but muscle memory. The military world took note. NATO nations studied the gunship model. Adversaries tried to replicate it, but few succeeded. Because what made Spooky effective wasn't just its weapons, it was its philosophy. A weapon born not from bigger bombs or faster jets, but from a simple, radical idea. What if a plane didn't run from danger, but circled it? The answer changed everything. By the end of 1944 whispers of gunship attacks began appearing in enemy diaries, propaganda, and intercepted messages. No longer dismissed as rumors, they were marked as confirmed threats, psychological hazards equal to artillery or tanks. And in a quiet field near Myitkyina, where the AC-47 first drew its circle of fire, American engineers erected a temporary sign above the runway. Spooky was here. The night is ours now. And it was. In the annals of warfare, there are weapons that destroy, and there are weapons that redefine. The AC-47 Spooky was the latter. It didn't just carve fire into the jungle, it carved fear into the minds of those who believed the night was theirs. What began as an aging cargo plane was reborn, through ingenuity transformed into a ghost that haunted treetops and rewrote the rules of engagement. In under 10 minutes, it could erase a regiment. But in truth, its power wasn't measured by casualties. It was measured by hesitation, by silence, by routes abandoned and doctrines broken. The Japanese weren't defeated by overwhelming force. They were defeated by the realization that their playbook no longer applied. Night was no longer safe. Cover no longer concealed. The enemy above didn't need to see them. It simply needed to circle. And when it did, the jungle itself became a trap. Spooky was a glimpse into the future, a fusion of old metal and new minds, of firepower and foresight. It laid the foundation for every modern gunship that would follow, from Vietnam's Puff the Magic Dragon to the thunderous orbit of today's AC-130 Spectres. Its legacy wasn't just technological, it was psychological, strategic, and deeply human. It showed that war isn't always won by who has the most, but by who thinks differently, who adapts faster, and who dares to turn the sky into a scalpel. In the end, Spooky did more than change a battlefield. It changed belief. It proved that innovation doesn't need to look like the future. Sometimes it looks like a slow old plane with a terrible noise and a circle of fire that never stops closing.